Tonight, Brian Williams sits down with NSA leaker Edward Snowden for an exclusive discussion on how he fundamentally changed the way we think about privacy in this country. NBC's Andrea Mitchell joins us live in Washington with more on Snowden's impact. Andrea.
Good morning, Mika. Well, accused of espionage at home and now marooned in Moscow for the last year, Edward Snowden may feel like a man without a country. But in his exclusive interview with Brian Williams, Snowden made his case, arguing he was never the low-level hacker that everyone from President Obama on down claimed.
An explosive claim from the man who pulled off the biggest intelligence theft in American history. In his first U.S. television interview, Edward Snowden tells NBC's Brian Williams he was a bigger player than we've known.
Were you trained as a spy? It seems to me spies probably look a lot more like Ed Snowden and a lot less like James Bond these days.
Well, it's no secret that the U.S. tends to get more and better intelligence out of computers nowadays than they do out of people. I was trained as a spy in sort of the traditional sense of the word, in that I lived and worked undercover overseas, pretending to work in a job that I'm not, and even being assigned a name that was not mine. Now, the government might deny these things. They might frame it in certain ways and say, oh, well, you know, he's a low-level analyst. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to use one position that I've had in a career here or there to distract from the totality of my experience, which is that I've worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, undercover, overseas. I've worked for the National Security Agency, undercover, overseas. And I've worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency as a lecturer at the Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy, where I developed sources and methods for keeping our information and people secure in the most hostile and dangerous environments around the world. So when they say I'm a low-level systems administrator, that I don't know what I'm talking about, I'd say it's somewhat misleading.
Not the hacker President Obama and members of Congress dismissed last June.
No, I'm not going to be scrambling jets to get a 29-year-old hacker.
I hope that we don't decide that our national security interests are going to be determined by a high school dropout who had a whole series of both academic troubles and employment troubles.
But even his harshest critics acknowledge Snowden is smart and knew how to exploit the system.
The most massive and most damaging theft of intelligence information in our history by Edward Snowden.
Michael Leiter is an NBC News analyst and serves on an NSA advisory panel.
The government is still working through to understand exactly what Edward Snowden got. They know what he had access to, but understanding exactly what he downloaded and exactly what he has when you're talking about millions of documents is a very significant task.
By current estimates, Snowden took as much as 1.7 million documents. The foreign policy and political damage has been incalculable, eroding trust with key allies like Germany's Angela Merkel, giving a propaganda bonanza to adversaries like Vladimir Putin. Mika?
Absolutely fascinating. And the question, I'll put it out to the table and you guys can throw it back to Andrea, is I don't know what's worse. Trying to in a misleading way, and I'm not saying that's what happened, but if it did, call this guy a hacker and a 29-year-old dropout. What's worse, that a hacker and a 29-year-old dropout could do what he did, or someone who's highly sophisticated who worked as a spy undercover for the United States? I'd almost feel more comfortable if the secondary was true.
Well, I mean, clearly just listening to him, he's not a 29-year-old hacker and a dropout. He's a very articulate, very smooth, very sophisticated young man who, but the question, Andrea, that I'd like to ask you is, according to your sources, the sources that you've spoken with, some of whom I have spoken with, do they think that Edward Snowden realized what he had, the totality of what he had?
They do. They think that he was deliberately going in and, as they put it, scraping and taking. They still don't know, and this is what's really extraordinary. We've talked to people, you know, our consultants and others who are still in the government. They do not know what he took. They are estimating it's 1.7 million documents. They know what he accessed. They don't know what he took. What we have confirmed is he did do 3 lectures for the Defense Intelligence Agency, as he claimed to Brian. He did 3 lectures, one in Japan, focusing on cyber attacks, how to defend and protect against cyber war, particularly from China. So he had a fairly sophisticated knowledge, but even though at one point he took and aced, I'm told, a very big test for advancement to an elite corps, Now there's an allegation also from his former bosses that he downloaded that test and, in effect, studied by having the test. So that's what anybody would call cheating. So there's a lot of controversy over what Mike Rogers had suggested, which is what the intelligence bosses are putting out, that he had a checkered career. There's no question, though, that he was very bright, and as you'll see in tonight's interview on Prime Time with Brian, he was very highly motivated, and it might surprise you what his motivation was.
Andrea, Snowden says he leaked these documents so that the American people could know what its government was doing in terms of watching the rest of us. But some of his critics have said he perhaps shared some of this information with Russia and maybe with China, although they've produced no evidence of that. Is there any evidence at this time that he has shared state secrets with other countries?
There is absolutely no evidence of that, certainly not wittingly. And what you'll hear tonight is his answers to that question about Russia, about Putin, surprising answers, and also what he says about whether he even took anything, because as Glenn Greenwald and others speaking for him have said, he did not physically carry some of that stuff out. So the journalists, Glenn Greenwald and others, and advocates, The Guardian, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and as you know, the Washington Post won a Pulitzer for this. This is all stuff that they now have, and they are going to be trickling it out.